Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm your host, and today we're traveling to the gleaming financial district of Hong Kong, where modern office towers reach toward the sky, with little regard for what lies beneath their foundations. In Chinese culture, there's a belief that certain places can hold on to the energy of traumatic events, especially locations where people died while working, driven by duty or desperation. These aren't your typical ghost stories. These are tales of spirits who never clocked out. Workers whose dedication extended far beyond the boundaries of life and death. Tonight, I want to share with you the story of a young financial analyst who discovered that when you volunteer for overtime shifts in certain buildings across Asia, you might not be working alone. So let's begin. Her story begins like so many others in Hong Kong's financial district. Let's call her Sarah, a 28-year-old financial analyst working for an international consulting firm on the 32nd floor of a glass and steel tower in Central. Ambitious from the start, Sarah had landed the job straight out of university with relentless effort. But life had turned heavy in recent months. A divorce finalized 6 months earlier, mounting legal bills, and an elderly mother whose medical expenses far outpaced her modest pension. So when her supervisor offered overtime shifts past 10 p.m., Sarah didn't hesitate. The extra pay could cover her mother's medication and maybe leave a little to save. The work was routine. Financial reports for international clients, syncing with European markets, while the city outside slowed down. Her younger colleagues admired her dedication. The older ones, not so much. Mrs. Chen, a veteran analyst, even warned her, "This building has bad feng shui. Too many people stay here alone at night." Sarah smiled politely, brushing it off as superstition.
Practical problems needed practical solutions, and overtime was just that.
The first weeks passed smoothly. She grew to appreciate the hush of the office after dark, the way silence replaced the daytime frenzy. Numbers were orderly, reliable, unlike people. But by her third week of late nights, Sarah began to notice things that didn't fit, anomalies that no spreadsheet could explain. It was a Tuesday evening when Sarah first encountered what she would later describe as the glitch. She had been working steadily for about 2 hours when she heard the familiar ding of the elevator arriving on her floor. This wasn't unusual. The security guards made regular rounds, and occasionally other late workers would arrive or depart. But when she glanced up from her monitor, expecting to see someone emerge from the elevator bank, the corridor remained empty. Curious, Sarah walked over to investigate. The elevator doors were closing just as she reached them, but she caught a glimpse of the floor indicator above. It read 14. She stared at the number for a long moment, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. According to the building directory, there was no 14th floor. Like many buildings across Asia, this tower had skipped the 4th floor entirely, a common practice due to the number's association with death in Chinese culture. The floors went directly from the 13th to the 15th. Sarah pressed the call button and waited. When the elevator arrived, she stepped inside and examined the floor buttons carefully. There was no button for the 14th floor, just as she'd expected. The numbers jumped from 13 to 15, with no gap or indication that a floor had been omitted. She pressed the button for the 15th floor and rode up, but found nothing unusual, just another typical office level, dark and empty for the night. The next evening, it happened again. Same time, same elevator, same impossible floor number. This time, Sarah was ready. She quickly walked to the elevator bank and pressed the call button before the doors could fully close. When they reopened, she peered inside. The elevator was empty, but there was something odd about the air. It felt colder than the rest of the building and carried a faint scent that reminded her of old paper and stale cigarettes. On Thursday, she decided to ask the security guard about it during his evening rounds. The guard, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened to her description with a neutral expression. "Technical problem," he said finally, his English accented with Cantonese inflections. "Building management knows about it. They're working to show a floor that doesn't exist," Sarah pressed. The guard shrugged, but she noticed he avoided making eye contact. "Old building computer system. Sometimes gets confused. Nothing to worry about." But the building wasn't old. It had been completed just 5 years ago, and the elevator system was state-of-the-art, with digital displays and computerized controls. Sarah wanted to ask more questions, but the guard was already moving on, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls as he continued his rounds. That night, Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on her work. Every time she heard the elevator ding, she would look up, half expecting to see that impossible number glowing above the doors. The routine that had once comforted her now felt unsettling. The silence of the building seemed heavier, more oppressive. Even the familiar hum of the air conditioning sounded different, almost like whispered conversations in a language she couldn't quite understand. By Friday, Sarah had convinced herself that the security guard was right. It had to be a technical glitch, some quirk in the elevator's programming that occasionally displayed the wrong floor number. These things happened in modern buildings: software bugs, hardware malfunctions, human error in the original installation. There was always a rational explanation. But as she packed up her things at the end of that week's overtime shifts, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the building itself was trying to tell her something. And whatever message it was sending, she wasn't sure she wanted to understand it. The following Monday, Sarah noticed something unusual during her overtime shift. At first, it was just the faint click of typing somewhere among the cubicles, a steady, purposeful rhythm that suggested another late-night worker. Relieved she wasn't alone, she went to introduce herself, only to find every desk empty, the monitors asleep. The typing stopped the moment she stood. She brushed it off as the building settling, but 2 hours later the sounds returned, this time accompanied by hushed voices. They carried the cadence of a business discussion, though the words were never quite clear, as if a radio were tuned just shy of the right frequency. Tracing the sounds, Sarah found herself near the glass-walled conference rooms. One glowed faintly. Inside, a figure in business attire stood at the table, gesturing as though giving a presentation, though the chairs around them sat empty. The corridor air turned unnervingly cold. Her breath misted as she reached for the door handle. The instant her hand touched the metal, the room went dark, the figure vanished. Silence returned. Sarah tried the locked door, peered inside, only shadows now. Shaken, she returned to her desk, convincing herself it was a climate control issue. But as she worked, her ears kept straining toward the conference rooms, and sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, the muted voices resumed, discussing quarterly projections no one would ever deliver. By her 4th week of overtime, Sarah had grown accustomed to the building's quirks. The phantom typing, the mysterious conference room presentations, even the elevator's impossible floor readings had become part of her nightly routine. She developed strategies for dealing with each anomaly: noise-canceling headphones for the typing sounds, avoiding the corridor near the conference rooms after 9 p.m., and simply ignoring the elevator's floor display altogether. But her carefully constructed rationalization began to crumble on a Thursday night when she decided to work later than usual. A particularly complex financial model required her attention, and she found herself still at her desk well past midnight. The building felt different at this hour, deeper in its silence, more settled in its shadows. Even the ever-present hum of the air conditioning seemed muted. It was then that she heard footsteps in the main corridor, not the heavy, authoritative stride of the security guard, but lighter steps. The quick, purposeful walk of someone familiar with the office layout. The footsteps seemed to pause near her cubicle, and Sarah looked up from her computer screen, expecting to see a colleague, or perhaps a cleaning crew member. No one was there. The footsteps resumed, moving toward the elevator bank. Sarah heard the familiar ding of arrival, followed by the soft whoosh of opening doors. After a moment, the doors closed, and the elevator began its ascent. She watched the floor indicator above the elevator bank, and her breath caught in her throat. The numbers climbed steadily, 33, 34, 35, and then, impossibly, 14. This time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and called the security desk in the lobby. The guard who answered sounded groggy, as if she'd woken him from a nap. "This is Sarah from the 32nd floor," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think someone just took the elevator to a floor that shouldn't exist." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Miss, I show you as the only person signed in for overtime tonight on your floor." "That's impossible. I just heard someone walking around and they took the elevator up." Another pause. "I'll come up and check. Stay where you are." 20 minutes later, the security guard arrived, the same tired-eyed man she'd spoken with before. This time, however, he didn't dismiss her concerns as easily. "You said you heard footsteps," he asked, his expression more serious than she'd seen before. Sarah nodded. "And the elevator went to the 14th floor again." The guard was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his radio. "Control, this is Wong on 32. Can you pull up the CCTV footage for this floor over the past hour?" The radio crackled with a response in rapid Cantonese. Sarah caught a few words she recognized, but the conversation was too fast for her limited language skills. Finally, the guard turned back to her. "They're reviewing the recordings now. Would you like to come down and see?" The security office in the lobby was cramped and filled with multiple monitor screens, showing feeds from cameras throughout the building. The night supervisor, an older woman with steel gray hair, gestured to a chair beside her desk. "Show me what happened," she said in accented English. They rewound the footage to 12:15 a.m. and watched Sarah's floor from multiple camera angles. Sarah could see herself clearly at her workstation, the blue glow of her computer screen illuminating her face in the darkness. The timestamp showed 12:22 when she looked up from her work, the exact moment she'd heard the footsteps. On the screen, they watched her head turn toward the corridor, her expression alert and listening. But the cameras showed no one else on the floor. No footsteps, no figure walking toward the elevators, no additional heat signatures registered by the building's motion sensors. "Here," the supervisor said, advancing the footage to 12:24. "This is when you say someone took the elevator." They switched to the elevator bank camera. The footage clearly showed Sarah alone at her desk, looking toward the elevators. The indicator lights showed an elevator arriving at the 32nd floor, doors opening, then closing after a brief pause. But the elevator interior camera showed an empty car. Most disturbing of all, the external camera showed Sarah standing up and walking toward the elevator bank, but on the footage, she appeared to be having an animated conversation with empty air. Her head turned as if listening to responses, her mouth moved as if speaking to someone, and at one point she even gestured toward the conference rooms, as if pointing something out to a companion. The conversation lasted nearly 5 minutes. On camera, Sarah appeared engaged and responsive, occasionally nodding or shaking her head, but she was completely alone. "I don't remember any of this," Sarah whispered, watching herself interact with an invisible presence. "I just heard footsteps and saw the elevator." The security supervisor exchanged glances with the guard. "Miss," she said gently, "has this kind of thing happened before?" Sarah stared at the screen, watching herself gesture animatedly to no one. The timestamp showed that this phantom conversation had taken place at exactly the time she'd called security to report hearing footsteps. According to the cameras, she'd been talking to thin air. For the first time since starting her overtime shifts, Sarah felt genuinely frightened. The next day, Sarah couldn't concentrate on her regular work. The CCTV footage played in her mind on an endless loop, the image of herself engaged in conversation with an invisible presence, gesturing and responding to someone who wasn't there. She'd called in sick, unable to face her colleagues or the building itself in daylight. It was her mother who finally provided the key to understanding what was happening. Sarah had gone to visit her after lunch, still shaken by the previous night's events. Her mother lived in a small apartment in an older part of Hong Kong, where the buildings were lower and the streets narrower, where traditional shops sold paper offerings and incense alongside modern conveniences. "You look tired, darling," her mother said in Cantonese, studying Sarah's face with the concerned eye of a parent. "Are you eating enough?" Sarah found herself telling her mother everything: the overtime shifts, the strange sounds, the elevator anomaly, and finally the security footage that showed her talking to someone who wasn't there. Her mother listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "Where is this building?" her mother asked finally. "Central District. It's on Queen's Road. The new tower with the blue glass facade?" Her mother was quiet for a long moment, then walked to a drawer in her small kitchen. She returned with an old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age and carefully preserved in plastic. "I saved this," she said, handing Sarah the clipping. "It happened before you were born, but I remember it clearly. The whole neighborhood was talking about it." The headline was in Chinese characters, but Sarah could make out the date, 1973, and recognize a few key words. There was a grainy black and white photograph showing firefighters and rescue workers outside a multi-story building. "Can you read it to me?" Sarah asked. Her mother adjusted her glasses and began to translate slowly. "Factory fire kills 17 workers during mandatory overtime shift. The Harmony Textile Factory on Queen's Road was destroyed by fire on Tuesday evening when electrical wiring in the main production area ignited. Workers were unable to escape due to locked exit doors, a common practice to prevent theft during night shifts." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Queen's Road, that's where my building is." Her mother nodded grimly. "The factory occupied the entire block, 4 stories high, with the main production floor on the second level. After the fire, the site remained empty for many years. People said it was cursed. No one wanted to build there. But eventually someone did build there." Yes, in the 1990s, a small office building was constructed. But that building had problems too. High turnover, employees reporting strange incidents, businesses failing quickly. It was demolished in 2015. Sarah's building had been completed in 2018, built on the same site where 17 workers had died during a mandatory overtime shift nearly 50 years ago. "The 14th floor," Sarah whispered, understanding finally dawning. In the old numbering system, the 4th floor would be the main production floor of the factory, her mother finished, where most of the workers died. That evening, Sarah returned to her building with a mixture of dread and determination. She needed to understand what was happening to her, but she also needed the overtime pay. Her mother's medication costs hadn't decreased, and finding another job with similar pay would take months she couldn't afford. She made her way up to the 32nd floor, but this time she was prepared. In her bag, she carried items her mother had insisted on: a small mirror, a red string bracelet, and 3 sticks of incense. "Respect," her mother had said. "If they're still there, still working, They deserve acknowledgement. The building felt different that night. The air seemed heavier, charged with an energy Sarah couldn't name. She set up her workstation as usual, but placed the mirror on her desk where she could see it clearly. According to her mother, mirrors could reveal things that normal vision couldn't detect. Around 9 p.m., the familiar sounds began, the typing, the murmur of conversations, the soft shuffle of footsteps. But this time, Sarah looked into the mirror instead of turning around directly. In the reflection, she could see them.
17 figures in work clothes from another era, moving through the office space as if it were still a textile factory. They bent over invisible machinery, carried phantom bolts of fabric, and consulted with supervisors who pointed to production quotas that existed only in their eternal overtime shift. One of them, a young woman about Sarah's age, looked up and met her eyes in the mirror. The woman smiled sadly and mouthed words that Sarah couldn't hear, but somehow understood. Still working. Always working. Sarah lifted her hand in a small wave, a gesture of acknowledgement. The woman nodded and returned to her invisible loom. For the rest of the evening, Sarah worked alongside the ghostly shift from 1973. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of them in the mirror or see their shadows moving across the walls. But for the first time since starting her overtime shifts, she didn't feel afraid. She felt oddly comforted by their presence. Fellow workers putting in long hours, doing what they had to do to take care of their families. When midnight approached, and it was time for Sarah to leave, she lit the 3 sticks of incense and placed them near the conference room where she had first seen the phantom presentation. The smoke curled upward, carrying with it her respect for workers who had never been properly mourned, never been officially remembered. The building felt lighter as she made her way to the elevator, and for the first time in weeks, when the doors opened, the floor indicator showed only the numbers that officially existed. Sarah continued her overtime shifts for another month, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. She now understood that she was sharing the space with workers from another time, people who had died doing exactly what she was doing, staying late, working extra hours to make ends meet, sacrificing their personal time for economic necessity. The parallels were not lost on her. Like the textile workers of 1973, she was putting in mandatory overtime to support her family. Like them, she was alone in the building during hours when most people were home with their loved ones. Like them, she was driven by the simple need to earn enough money to survive in an expensive city where wages never seemed to keep pace with the cost of living. But there was one crucial difference. Sarah had a choice. The textile workers had been trapped by locked doors and safety regulations prioritizing property over people. They had died because profit margins mattered more than proper exit routes, because productivity targets were more important than worker safety. The experience changed Sarah. She began leaving the office by midnight, taking breaks and refusing to let desperation override her instincts. To her, the ghostly workers weren't threats, but warnings, reminders of what happens when work eclipses life. Colleagues noticed the shift. Sarah pushed back on impossible deadlines, urged others to value their time. Some credited her divorce or family struggles, but Sarah knew the truth. She had learned from 17 teachers who had given everything to their jobs. In time, her finances stabilized, her mother's health improved, and she earned a promotion that ended her need for overtime. Yet she never forgot the lessons of those late nights on the 32nd floor. The tower still stands on Queens Road. New employees still volunteer for after-hours shifts. Most report nothing unusual, but sometimes whispers surface, phantom floor numbers glowing on elevators, the smell of dyes in hallways that should only smell of coffee, or voices murmuring over projections that will never be filed. In Chinese tradition, sights of sudden or unjust death can hold lingering energy, di qi, unless properly cleansed. Rapid development often ignores these rituals, leaving old sorrows woven into new walls. Folklore across Asia tells of ghost workers, spirits trapped by duty endlessly repeating their labor. Rational minds point to fatigue, isolation, or stress as explanations for Sarah's visions. Hallucinations, structural quirks, electrical faults, all plausible. And yet, the precision of her knowledge about the 1973 fire suggests something deeper, harder to dismiss. Maybe her mind tuned into echoes of history, piecing together forgotten stories. Or maybe the past truly lingers, especially in places where the same sacrifices continue night after night. Whether supernatural or psychological, the message remains the same. Work should serve life, not consume it. Progress should never demand its highest cost from those who can least afford to pay. What do you think? Were Sarah's colleagues spirits or shadows of her own mind? And does it matter so long as the warning endures?